We've been very lucky. My mother was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much.
The private library at Buckingham Palace was completely silent when Princess Anne did the unthinkable. She looked her brother, King Charles, straight in the eye, took his official royal order, and tossed it right back across the mahogany desk. She said a single, brutal word, no. Within hours, the Princess Royal packed her bags, fled London, and placed her country estate under a total armed lockdown. It was an unprecedented act of open rebellion. For the first time in modern history, a senior royal defied the crown, triggering a furious behind-the-scenes war that left the entire palace establishment in absolute shock. The red leather folder and a flat refusal. The grandfather clock in the corner of the private library ticked loudly. Princess Anne stood near the tall window, looking out at the gravel courtyard of Buckingham Palace. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in October. She wore her usual tweed jacket and had her hair pulled back tightly. She did not look happy. King Charles sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He looked tired. A heavy red leather folder sat right in the middle of the green blotter. The folder was stamped with the gold royal cipher and the words, "Sovereign Decree." Charles cleared his throat. He told his sister that the document inside required her immediate signature. The king explained his new plan for the family finances. He wanted to consolidate all the private royal lands. He stated that the crown needed to look leaner to the public. To achieve this, he was ordering Anne to hand over the management of her country estate, Gatcombe Park, to the Central Treasury team in London. Anne did not move from the window. She did not even look at the folder. She stated that the estate in Gloucestershire was her private home. It was bought for her by Queen Elizabeth using private funds in 1976. She reminded her brother that the taxpayers had never spent a single penny on its upkeep. Charles grew impatient. He tapped his fingers on the desk. He insisted that the legal status of the land had changed under the new Land Acts. He argued that as the reigning monarch, he held the ultimate authority over all family properties. He pushed the red folder 2 inches closer to the edge of the desk. He ordered her to sign the paperwork before the noon meeting. Anne finally turned around. She walked slowly toward the desk. Her leather boots made a sharp, clicking sound on the oak floorboards. She reached out her hand, but she did not pick up the pen. Instead, she grabbed the red leather folder and tossed it right back across the desk. It slid across the wood and hit the king's silver inkwell. She looked her brother straight in the eye. She said a single flat word, "No." Charles froze. His face turned a deep, angry red. No senior royal had spoken to him in that manner since his coronation. He stood up from his chair, his robes rustling. He warned his sister that a refusal to follow a sovereign command was a direct challenge to the crown itself. He stated that even family members had to obey the rules of the institution. Anne did not flinch. She told him that he was acting like an accountant, not a king. She stated that she had spent 50 years working for the family without a single complaint. She had completed thousands of public engagements, but she refused to let a group of London lawyers take away her home. She turned on her heel and walked directly to the heavy library door. She pulled it open, stepping out into the long gallery. 2 senior private secretaries, including Sir Clive Alderton, were waiting in the hallway. They held clipboards and scheduling tablets. They looked up in surprise as the Princess Royal marched past them. Her face was completely set in stone. She did not acknowledge their presence. Clive tried to step into her path. He asked if the documents had been signed for the Treasury file. Anne did not stop walking. She told him to get out of her way. Her voice was so sharp that the secretary immediately stepped back against the wall, dropping his pen onto the carpet. Anne walked straight down the grand staircase and out into the royal mews. Her personal security officer, Sergeant Richard Evans, was waiting by her dark blue Range Rover. He saw the look on her face and immediately opened the driver's door. He asked if they were heading back to St. James's Palace. Anne climbed into the driver's seat herself. She told Evans to get into the passenger side. She slammed the door shut and started the engine. She stated that they were leaving London immediately. They were heading straight back to Gloucestershire. The vehicle sped out of the palace gates, leaving the security team at the lodge in total confusion. They had not received a clearance notice for the Princess Royal's departure. The king's office was left completely blind. Back in the library, Charles stood by his desk, looking at the rejected red folder. He picked up his secure internal telephone. He dialed the office of the Crown Estate Commissioners. He told them that his sister had left the building without signing the transfer papers. He ordered them to halt all digital communications with the Gatcombe Park office. The king was determined to enforce his order. He believed that if he let his sister defy him, his authority over the rest of the family would completely evaporate. He called for a special meeting of his legal advisors to take place at 2 o'clock. Meanwhile, Anne drove down the M4 motorway at a steady, fast pace. She did not use the hands-free phone system in her car. Her mobile phone was buzzing constantly in her handbag on the back seat. The screen showed repeated missed calls from the palace switchboard and from Prince William. She ignored every single one of them. She was already planning her next move. She knew her brother would try to use legal loopholes to freeze her estate accounts. But Anne had spent decades studying the old family charters. She knew secrets about the land registry that Charles had completely forgotten. She looked over at Sergeant Evans. She told him to use his radio to contact the main security lodge at Gatcombe Park. She gave a very specific command. The estate gates were to be closed and padlocked immediately. No vehicles from the London Palace offices were to be allowed onto the property under any circumstances. Evans looked surprised, but he obeyed the order without question. He clicked his radio and relayed the message to the guards in Gloucestershire. The lockdown was officially active. The Princess Royal was going to war with the king, and she had no intention of backing down. Armed guards at the gates of Gatcombe Park. The dark blue vehicle pulled into the long gravel driveway of the estate just after 1 o'clock. The heavy iron gates of the property swung shut immediately behind it. 2 estate guards wrapped thick steel chains around the bars and secured them with a heavy brass padlock. The lockdown was fully operational. Anne stepped out of the car into the cold autumn drizzle. She did not walk toward the main house. Instead, she walked directly to the old stone estate office located near the stables. Waiting on the porch was a tall man in a wax cotton jacket. This was Captain Thomas Miller, a retired Royal Marines officer who had managed the estate's physical security for over a decade. Miller stepped forward and gave a brief nod. He stated that the perimeter was completely secure. He had already reassigned the internal patrol routes to cover the blind spots along the northern boundary wall. He looked at the heavy chains on the main gate and asked if the situation in London had deteriorated completely. Anne walked past him into the warm office. She pulled off her wet jacket and tossed it onto a wooden chair. She stated that the king was attempting a total hostile takeover of the property assets. She explained that Charles wanted to use a new treasury mandate to strip her of her legal rights to the land. Miller closed the office door and walked over to a large printed map of the estate layout, pinned to the wall. He pointed to a narrow access road that ran through the woods on the eastern edge of the property. He stated that the local police had no jurisdiction to enter that specific track. It was classified as a private royal right-of-way under a charter from 1921. He revealed that he had already contacted 3 retired officers from his old regiment. These men had arrived at the estate an hour earlier in a plain white utility van. They were not wearing official royal uniforms. They were carrying standard communications gear and were currently positioned at the secondary farm entrances to intercept any unexpected visitors. Anne approved of the strategy with a sharp nod. She sat down at the main desk and looked at the ancient green computer terminal that handled the local farm accounts. She stated that they needed to act before the palace lawyers issued a formal freezing order on the estate's commercial bank accounts. Suddenly, the landline phone on the desk began to ring. The digital display showed the direct line for the Privy Council office in London. Anne did not pick up the receiver. She let it ring until the sound stopped, only for it to start again 3 seconds later. Miller stood by the window, watching the main driveway through a pair of binoculars. He reported that a dark gray saloon car had just pulled up outside the main gates. He recognized the vehicle. It belonged to the Special Diplomatic Protection Unit of the Metropolitan Police. 2 men in suits stepped out of the vehicle. They walked up to the iron bars and began speaking to the estate guard through the mesh. They held up an official leather folder bearing the royal crest. They were demanding immediate entry to deliver a personal message from the king's private secretary. The estate guard refused to unlock the padlock. He followed Miller's strict instructions and pointed toward the small intercom speaker mounted on the stone pillar. Miller pressed a button on the office desk to activate the speaker system. He spoke directly into the microphone. He stated that the estate was currently closed for a private administrative audit. He informed the officers that no unscheduled deliveries or official couriers would be accepted today. The senior officer outside looked directly at the security camera. His voice sounded distorted through the small speaker. He stated that he was carrying a formal executive summons signed by the monarch. He warned that obstructing a royal courier was a serious breach of protocol that would be reported directly to the Home Secretary. Miller did not argue. He simply cut the power to the intercom system, plunging the outside gate speaker into total silence. He turned to Anne and stated that the London team would likely return with a formal court warrant from a Gloucestershire magistrate by sunset. Anne smiled grimly. She stood up from the desk and walked over to a heavy iron safe built into the stone wall behind the filing cabinets. She turned the mechanical dial to a combination she had memorized decades ago. The heavy door swung open, revealing a stack of old leather ledger books and a velvet pouch. She pulled out a yellowed parchment document from 1953. This was a private declaration signed by her grandfather, King George VI, just weeks before his death. It gave the female line of the family absolute, unrevoked veto power over any future structural changes to the Gloucestershire lands. She handed the parchment to Miller. She told him to make 3 physical photocopies immediately. She stated that they were going to use this document to completely block the king's legal maneuvers. Before Miller could reach the copy machine, the power inside the office suddenly failed. The computer screen went completely blank, and the overhead fluorescent lights flickered twice before dying. The room was left in near total darkness, illuminated only by the gray light coming through the window panes. Miller immediately reached for his digital two-way radio. He checked the signal bars and cursed softly. He stated that the local cellular tower link had been entirely cut. The palace was not waiting for a magistrate's warrant. They had quietly used their administrative authority to cut the estate's digital communications and power lines from a central control hub in London. The real siege had begun. The intercepted delivery truck and the locked barn. The estate remained in near total darkness as the clock struck 4 in the afternoon. The cold autumn rain grew heavier, turning the long gravel drive into a slick, muddy track. Inside the darkened estate office, Captain Miller clicked on a battery-powered tactical flashlight. He adjusted his radio handset, which was now running on a closed short-range tactical frequency that bypassed the disabled cellular towers. A sharp burst of static came through the small speaker. A voice belonging to one of the retired Marine guards at the eastern perimeter reported an unscheduled vehicle approaching the hidden boundary track. It was not a police car or a palace limousine. It was a massive, unmarked commercial box truck with local Gloucestershire license plates. The vehicle was driving without its main headlights to avoid detection from the main road. Anne pulled a heavy wax coat over her shoulders and grabbed a high-powered spotlight from the desk charging dock. She told Miller that she was going down to the track herself. She knew exactly what that truck was carrying. It was the physical backup archive she had quietly ordered from her private storage facility in Bristol just 24 hours earlier. The two of them walked out into the pouring rain, their boots sinking into the wet turf as they cut through the stable yard. They reached the narrow wood-lined trail just as the massive truck ground to a halt beneath the low oak branches. The engine idled with a deep diesel thrum that seemed dangerously loud in the quiet countryside. The driver's side door slid open. A man wearing a plain boiler suit stepped down into the mud. This was David Vance, a trusted private logistics contractor who had handled secure transport for the Princess Royal's equestrian operations for 2 decades. He looked visibly nervous, his eyes darting toward the main road. Vance reported that he had been followed by a dark estate car for the first 10 miles out of the Bristol depot. He had managed to lose them by taking a series of narrow tractor paths through the local farmlands. He warned Anne that the palace security team had established a mobile checkpoint near the main highway intersection, just 2 miles away. They were actively scanning the registration plates of all commercial vehicles entering the area. Anne ordered him to move the truck immediately toward the old stone tithe barn at the rear of the property. Before Vance could climb back into the cab, the high-beam headlights of a silver utility vehicle flickered on at the far end of the woodland track. The vehicle accelerated rapidly down the narrow path, throwing up large sprays of muddy water. It skidded to a halt just 10 yards from the back of the delivery truck, completely blocking any further movement. 2 men in official gray windbreakers stepped out of the utility vehicle. These were special tactical agents from the Sovereign Protection Command, the elite branch of the police tasked with enforcing royal security mandates. The The senior agent carried a rugged electronic tablet housed in a heavy waterproof casing. He walked directly up to Anne, wiping the rain from his forehead. He stated that his team was operating under an emergency executive order, issued directly by the Home Office at 3 o'clock. The order authorized the immediate seizure and inspection of all undocumented cargo entering any royal residence currently undergoing an administrative audit. He demanded that David Vance open the rear roller door of the box truck for a full physical inspection. William stepped out from the passenger side of the silver utility vehicle. He had bypassed his own office staff to come down to Gloucestershire personally. He wore a simple green raincoat and looked completely exhausted. He walked past the police agents and stood directly in front of his aunt under the dripping branches. William pleaded with Anne to stop the physical resistance. He stated that the King's legal team was already drafting a public statement regarding an administrative restructuring of the family properties. He warned her that if a commercial delivery truck was photographed being blocked by armed police at her gates, the media would turn the dispute into a massive public scandal within minutes. Anne looked at her nephew with absolute calm. She pointed her spotlight directly at the electronic tablet in the police agent's hand. She asked the officer if the executive order had been ratified by a local Gloucestershire County judge, as required under the territorial property laws of 1925. The agent hesitated, looking over at William for guidance. He admitted that the document was currently a direct ministerial directive from London, meaning it lacked the full legal weight of a local judicial warrant on private freehold land. Anne turned back to William. She stated that until a local judge signed a physical piece of paper, the police were legally trespassing on her private farm track. She ordered David Vance to back the truck straight up into the open doors of the stone barn. William realized he had no legal leverage to enforce the King's order without causing a physical altercation between the state police and his aunt's private guards. He raised his hand to signal the tactical agents to step back toward their vehicle. He told Anne that he had not come to lock her out of her home, but to prevent his father from making a catastrophic institutional error. The massive box truck reversed slowly into the cavernous interior of the old tithe barn. The heavy timber doors were immediately swung shut by Miller's men, who secured the handles with a massive steel bar. Anne turned to William and told him to follow her inside through the small side pass door. She stated that if he wanted to see what his father was so terrified of, he was about to get a direct lesson in family history. The secrets were no longer staying in London. An erased database and a furious call from London. The air inside the old stone tithe barn was freezing and smelled of dry hay. Captain Miller clicked on 2 battery-powered halogen work lamps, casting long, sharp shadows against the high timber rafters. David Vance used a metal crowbar to pry open the heavy wooden crates that had just been unloaded from the truck. Inside the boxes sat dozens of old metal ledger binders. These were not standard historical documents. They were the primary accounting books for the private royal estates, dating from 1936 through 1972. William walked over to the first open crate. He pulled out a thick ledger bound in cracked black oilskin. He flipped it open, his flashlight beam scanning the columns of neat, handwritten figures. He realized instantly that these books contained the unredacted financial records of the family's private offshore holdings during the middle of the 20th century. Anne stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She stated that while the public database in London showed a clean record of estate transactions, the physical copies in this barn told the absolute truth. She explained that decades ago, a massive portion of the family's private wealth had been legally separated from the official crown estate to protect it from impending nationalization laws. Before William could answer, his personal mobile phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. The digital display showed a highly secure encryption code originating directly from the private office of King Charles at Buckingham Palace. William slid the screen to answer and placed the phone on the glass lid of a nearby display case, activating the speakerphone. The voice of Sir Clive Alderton came through the line, sounding completely frantic. The senior secretary did not waste time with formal titles. He stated that the Central Land Registry database in London had just suffered a catastrophic system failure. Clive revealed that at exactly 4 o'clock, the digital files containing the historical deed boundaries for Gatcombe Park and Sandringham had gone completely blank. The main server housing the private family compacts had been entirely wiped from the system. The palace IT security team in London was in a state of absolute panic, unable to trace the source of the deletion. Anne looked down at the phone and spoke with a cold, clear conviction. She informed the secretary that there was no system failure. She stated that she had personally authorized the digital detachment of the Gloucestershire files from the Central London network hours earlier. Clive gasped over the line. He warned the Princess Royal that destroying or altering sovereign administrative records was a direct violation of the Public Records Act. He argued that the King's legal team could use this digital breach to justify an immediate executive takeover of the entire estate property by the state authorities. Anne countered his argument instantly. She reminded him that, under the private family charter of 1952, the digital management of her specific lands remained under her personal jurisdiction as long as she maintained her public duties. Because she had never resigned her position, the central office in London had no legal right to access her local server data without her explicit written consent. She told Clive to inform her brother that if he wanted the digital files restored to the main palace network, he would have to cancel the emergency executive order and withdraw his lawyers from the local Gloucestershire courts before sunset. She reached down and cut the call, plunging the barn back into silence. William looked at his aunt, a mixture of shock and respect visible on his face. He realized that Anne had completely outmaneuvered the palace establishment within the span of a single afternoon. She had used her deep knowledge of the old administrative bylaws to turn a simple property dispute into an absolute stalemate. He walked deeper into the barn, looking at the sheer volume of the physical archives stored in the crates. He asked Anne what she intended to do with these records if the king refused to back down from his consolidation plan. Anne walked over to a heavy iron desk in the corner of the barn and picked up a modern electronic tablet that was running on a private battery-powered satellite link. She showed the screen to William. The display showed a complete, high-resolution digital backup of every single page inside the black oilskin ledgers. She revealed that she had already uploaded the encrypted files to a secure, private cloud server located outside the jurisdiction of the British courts. If the palace chose to use physical force or legal tricks to evict her from Gatcombe Park, the entire financial history of the modern royal house would be automatically transferred to the International Press Corps within 60 seconds. The reality of the situation settled over William like a physical weight. This was no longer a private family disagreement about land management. Anne was holding a lever of absolute power that could permanently dismantle the public credibility of the entire institution. He turned to his aunt and stated that he understood her anger, but he pleaded with her to consider the long-term survival of the crown. He argued that if these historical financial files were exposed to the modern media machine, the public backlash would destroy any remaining trust in the family, regardless of who legally owned the land. Anne looked at her nephew, her expression softening slightly for the first time that day. She told him that she had spent her entire life protecting the institution from its own mistakes. She stated that she was not acting out of malice toward her brother, but out of a desperate need to stop the current administration from making a fatal structural error. She explained that Charles was being misled by his London advisors, who wanted to centralize everything to look modern. She believed that by destroying the independent status of the private family estates, the king was quietly stripping the future generations of their financial independence, leaving them completely vulnerable to future political changes in Parliament. She looked William directly in the eye and stated that she was fighting this battle to protect his own future inheritance, and she had no intention of losing. The secret treaties of the Princess Royal. William stepped closer to the wooden table inside the barn. The halogen lamps buzzed softly against the stone masonry. He reached down and picked up the oldest leather ledger from the crate. It was dated 1937, the exact year his great-grandfather took the throne after the Great Abdication Crisis. Anne pulled out a single sheet of heavy parchment from the inside pocket of the cover. The document bore a large, dark red wax seal that had cracked into 3 distinct pieces over the decades. This was the original Gloucestershire Trust Compact, signed privately by King George VI just weeks after his sudden accession to the throne. Anne pointed her flashlight at the 3rd paragraph of the text. The legal script was short and clear. It stated that the lands of Gatcombe Park were permanently designated as an absolute freehold sovereign gift to the female line of the family, completely exempt from any future crown consolidation acts or parliamentary oversight. William read the lines silently, his face turning pale in the sharp white light. He realized instantly that his father's legal advisors in London had made a catastrophic error. They had treated the Gloucestershire property as a standard crown holding that could be moved around by a simple executive order from the Treasury. Anne explained the reality of the document. Her father and mother had deliberately structured the property this way to ensure that the female heirs of the house would always maintain a position of total financial independence from the main line of succession. It was an unbreakable legal shield designed specifically to prevent a future king from stripping his siblings of their livelihood. She looked at her nephew and stated that if Charles attempted to enforce the Red Folder Decree in a public court, this parchment would immediately invalidate his entire sovereign authority over the private family assets. The king would be exposed as having attempted an illegal land seizure against his own sister on live television. William knew the battle was completely over. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket and walked to the small side door of the barn, stepping out into the cool evening air. He dialed the direct private line for his father's study at Buckingham Palace. King Charles picked up on the second ring. His voice sounded thin and strained over the encrypted network. He asked his son if the security teams had secured the physical cargo inside the barn. William front-loaded the truth. He told his father to order Sir Clive Alderton to stand down the lawyers immediately. He explained that Anne held the original 1937 compact with the red wax seal. He stated clearly that any further legal action by London would result in an absolute institutional disaster in the courts the following morning. The line went completely silent for 10 seconds. The only sound was the crackle of the digital static. Charles finally spoke, his tone shifting from anger to absolute exhaustion. He asked if the document was truly unrevoked. William confirmed that it was entirely valid and backed by a complete digital archive stored on an overseas cloud server. The king quietly told his son that he would handle the withdrawal from London immediately. By 8 o'clock that evening, the emergency executive order was officially canceled by the Home Office. The dark gray police saloon cars parked outside the main iron gates started their engines and drove back toward the motorway, their headlights disappearing into the thick valley mist. The power inside the estate office flickered back on with a loud click. The green computer screens rebooted, and the local land registry database was automatically restored to the central network by Anne's local IT assistant. The digital blockade had been lifted as quickly as it had begun. William walked back into the main house with his aunt. They sat down in the small, comfortable morning room overlooking the rear gardens. A fire was burning in the grate, casting a warm yellow light over the old family photographs on the mantelpiece. Anne poured 2 cups of tea from a plain silver pot. She looked entirely relaxed, as if the high-stakes confrontation on the muddy farm track had been nothing more than a routine afternoon check on her horses. She told William that she had no intention of gloating over the victory. She explained that she would send a private memorandum to her brother the following morning, outlining a new framework for cooperative asset management that protected the independent status of all secondary family properties. She wanted to ensure the king saved face before the public press caught wind of any internal rift. An hour later, the palace press office issued a short, generic statement to the BBC and other major news outlets. The release claimed that the temporary security closure at Gatcombe Park was part of a planned routine review of physical defense perimeters across all rural royal residences following recent global threat assessments. The media completely accepted the explanation. The reporters outside the London gates packed up their cameras and moved on to other domestic political stories, completely unaware that the Princess Royal had just successfully staged a total rebellion against the reigning monarch behind the closed doors of her estate. William stood up to leave just before midnight. He shook his aunt's hand on the porch, looking out at the peaceful, quiet fields of the estate. He walked back to his vehicle, knowing that the balance of power inside the family had permanently shifted. Anne had proved that the old ways of the crown could still defeat the modern bureaucratic machine, and the lesson would not be forgotten by the future king. The sharp, no-nonsense determination of Princess Anne has once again changed the hidden history of the British royal family behind closed doors. Now, we want to hear your thoughts on this incredible country estate standoff. Do you think the Princess Royal was right to completely defy a direct sovereign order from King Charles to protect her private inheritance? Or should every member of the family follow the central command of the crown without exception? Drop your perspective in the comment section below. If you want to stay ahead of the curve on the true unredacted stories shifting the power dynamics inside the modern monarchy, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and turn on all your notifications so you never miss our next exclusive report.